The town of Silver Creek lay blanketed in snow, its quiet streets illuminated by flickering lampposts. Nestled on the outskirts was Silver Paw's shelter, a haven for abandoned and unwanted animals. However, the shelter was anything but comforting. The paint on the walls had chipped, the floors were cold, and the air carried a mix of dampness and sorrow. In the farthest corner of the shelter, a single dim light bulb illuminated a kennel where two dogs lay close together. Max, a Labrador with a coat that had long since dulled from its glossy black to a patchy gray, shifted slightly, trying to keep Daisy, a timid Australian Shepherd mix, warm against the icy draft. They had been inseparable for the past 3 years, ever since Daisy had arrived at the shelter. Max had once been a police dog, strong and agile, a hero in his prime. But age and an injured leg had ended his career. His handler couldn't keep him, and so he was left at the shelter. Daisy, on the other hand, was a farm dog, abandoned when her owners moved to the city. Both had their spirits dimmed by years of waiting, forgotten and overlooked by potential adopters. The shelter staff had long noticed their bond. Max, ever the protector, would stand guard while Daisy ate, and Daisy, despite her timid nature, would nestle beside Max whenever he limped back from a walk. Together, they found solace in each other, even as hope for a new home faded. That evening, Dr. Rachel Carter, the shelter's veterinarian, walked down the rows of kennels with a clipboard in hand. Her face was lined with exhaustion, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun. Rachel had worked at Silver Paws for years and had seen too many animals come and go. Some found homes, but others weren't as lucky. She stopped in front of Max and Daisy's kennel, watching them for a moment. Max raised his head, his clouded eyes meeting hers. Daisy, ever shy, pressed herself closer to him. "Hey, you two," Rachel whispered, crouching down. "I wish I had better news." The shelter's funding was running dry, and they were over capacity. A decision had been made by the board. Older animals, those deemed unadoptable, would have to be euthanized to make room for others. Rachel's heart ached as she looked at the list in her hand. Max and Daisy were at the top. In another part of the shelter, Maggie Harris, a young volunteer with curly brown hair and a fiery determination, was cleaning out food bowls. She overheard Rachel talking to another staff member about the list and froze. Maggie had a soft spot for Max and Daisy, often sneaking them extra blankets and treats. "No," Maggie said aloud, startling the staff member. "You can't put them down." Rachel sighed. "Maggie, it's not what I want either. But we're out of options. They've been here for years, and no one even asks about them. That's because people don't know their story." Maggie shot back, her voice cracking with emotion. "If they did, they'd care." Rachel hesitated. She knew Maggie's passion for the animals was genuine, but the reality of running a shelter wasn't as simple as wishful thinking. Still, something in Maggie's plea struck a chord. "What are you suggesting?" Rachel asked cautiously. "Let me show the world who they are," Maggie said. "I'll make a video, show how much they mean to each other, how much they still have to give. Just give me a few days." Rachel looked back toward Max and Daisy's kennel. They were huddled together, Daisy resting her head on Max's paw. "All right," Rachel said softly. "You've got 3 days." But after that, she didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken reality hung heavy in the air. That night, Maggie stayed late at the shelter. She set up her phone, positioning it just outside Max and Daisy's kennel. As she hit record, Max lifted his head, and Daisy followed, their eyes filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. Maggie's voice cracked as she narrated. "This is Max and Daisy. They've been here for years, waiting for someone to see them, to love them. They're not just dogs. They're best friends. And now, they're running out of time." As she edited the video, Maggie included clips of Max limping, but still wagging his tail, when Daisy leaned against him. She added a shot of them sharing a blanket, their noses almost touching. The final frame was a close-up of their faces, side by side, with the words, "They only have each other." With a deep breath, Maggie hit post. The next morning, the shelter's phone began to ring. Messages poured in on social media. People from the town, and even beyond, commented, shared, and asked, "How can we help Max and Daisy?" For the first time in years, it felt like hope was stirring in the cold, quiet shelter. But none of them could have anticipated how quickly things would escalate, or how high the stakes would become. The snow outside Silver Paw's shelter had thickened overnight, blanketing the streets of Silver Creek in white silence. Inside the shelter, however, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet excitement. Maggie Harris sat at the reception desk, phone in hand, scrolling through hundreds of comments on the video she had posted the night before. Her heart swelled as she read messages from strangers offering donations, blankets, and food. A woman from Ohio asked if Max and Daisy could be transported across state lines. A family in California inquired if they could foster the two dogs until a permanent home was found. People cared. "Rachel, come look at this," Maggie called, waving her phone in the air as Dr. Rachel Carter walked by with a cup of coffee. Rachel leaned in, her eyes scanning the phone screen. A soft smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I have to admit, Maggie, I didn't expect this kind of response." "I told you," Maggie said with a grin. People just needed to know their story. But as Rachel's smile faded, Maggie sensed hesitation. "What's wrong?" Maggie asked, frowning. Rachel sighed, setting her cup down on the desk. "It's not that simple, Maggie. Even with all this attention, we can't just hand Max and Daisy over to the first person who asks." Maggie nodded, but she could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I know that, but it's better than the alternative." Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at the clipboard tucked under her arm, the same clipboard that held the list of animals scheduled for euthanasia. Max and Daisy's names were still there, circled in red ink. By mid-morning, the shelter doorbell chimed, snapping Maggie from her thoughts. She turned to see Richard Coleman stepping inside, brushing snow from his heavy overcoat. His presence felt out of place in the modest shelter. Richard was known around Silver Creek for his wealth and influence. He owned half the businesses downtown, and his sprawling estate sat on the outskirts, hidden behind wrought iron gates. His reputation was one of control, whether it was in business, charity events, or even animal adoptions. Rachel approached him first. "Mr. Coleman," she greeted politely. "What can I do for you?" Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward the kennels, where Max and Daisy lay curled together. "I saw the video circulating last night. Quite the story," he remarked, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. "I understand these two are in need of a home." Rachel hesitated, but Maggie stepped forward. "Yes, but we're looking for a family, not just a place to keep them." Richard's gaze shifted to Maggie, and the hint of a smirk played on his lips. "Of course, I'd like to adopt them both. I have a large property, plenty of space. I'll ensure they're well taken care of." The words sounded rehearsed. Rachel glanced at Maggie. "That's generous, Mr. Coleman, but—" "Before you say no," Richard interrupted smoothly, pulling out a checkbook, "I'm prepared to make a sizable donation to Silver Paws. Enough to cover operational costs for the next 6 months." Maggie's eyes narrowed. There was something unsettling about how easily Richard threw money at the problem, as if Max and Daisy were commodities rather than living beings. Rachel swallowed hard. The offer was tempting. The shelter desperately needed funding. But Maggie knew what Rachel was thinking. "I appreciate the offer," Rachel began carefully, "but may I ask why you're interested in adopting them?" Richard's expression hardened slightly, though his smile remained. "Call it philanthropy. I've always been fond of Labradors. They'll make a fine addition to the animal enclosure on my property." Maggie's stomach twisted. An enclosure. She imagined Max and Daisy behind cold metal bars, isolated from people, mere decorations for Richard's estate. "With all due respect, Mr. Coleman," Maggie interjected, "Max and Daisy deserve to be part of a family. They're not just ornaments for a property." Richard's eyes locked onto hers. There was a flicker of annoyance, but he kept his composure. "I understand your concerns, but I assure you, they'll be well-fed, warm, and cared for. That's more than they have here." Rachel glanced uneasily between Maggie and Richard. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. Rachel sat in her office long after Richard left, staring at the check he had left behind. It wasn't filled out, but the signature at the bottom practically whispered temptation. 6 months of funding. That could mean more medicine, better food, even new beds for the animals. Maggie knocked softly on the door. "Do you think I'm overreacting?" Maggie asked, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. Rachel shook her head. "No, I think you're right. But that doesn't mean this is easy." Maggie nodded, glancing at the sleeping forms of Max and Daisy through the office window. "They've been through enough. I can't let him take them just because he has money." Rachel smiled weakly. "You remind me of why I got into this job." The next morning, the sun rose over Silver Creek, painting the shelter in soft gold light. Maggie arrived early to check on Max and Daisy. She sat by their kennel, reaching through the bars to scratch behind Max's ear. "I'll find you a home," she whispered. "I promise." But just as she stood to leave, the shelter's front door swung open. Richard Coleman was back, and this time he wasn't alone. Two men in suits followed him inside. One held a clipboard, the other a pen. Richard's expression was steely. Rachel appeared beside Maggie, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "Mr. Coleman, I wasn't expecting you this morning." "I've spoken with the board," Richard said coolly. "They agree with my offer." Maggie's blood ran cold. "The dogs are coming with me today." Rachel's jaw tightened, but Maggie stepped in front of Max and Daisy's kennel, her hands clenched into fists. "They're not leaving with you," she said defiantly. A tense silence filled the room. Richard raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "You can't stop this, Miss Harris." Rachel placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder. "Actually, she can." Richard's eyes flicked toward Rachel, who stood tall and firm. "This shelter still answers to me, and I say Max and Daisy aren't going anywhere." The room buzzed with silent tension. "Let's see how long that lasts," Richard muttered as he turned and strode toward the exit. As the door slammed shut, Maggie exhaled deeply, heart pounding. The fight wasn't over yet. The shelter was quiet after Richard Coleman's departure, but the air felt heavy, as if his presence still lingered. Maggie sat cross-legged in front of Max and Daisy's kennel, absently running her fingers along the cold metal bars. Max's eyes drooped as Daisy nestled into his side, but Maggie's mind raced. Rachel leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, gazing thoughtfully out the window. The snow outside had begun to melt under the weak winter sun, leaving patches of slush along the sidewalks. "I can't believe the board agreed to his offer," Maggie muttered, breaking the silence. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Money talks, Maggie. Richard's donated to the shelter before. It's hard for them to turn him down when we're barely staying afloat." Maggie's jaw tightened. It shouldn't be about money. Max and Daisy deserve more than to be locked up like trophies on his estate. Rachel knelt beside Maggie, lowering her voice. "I know, and I promise I'm not letting them go without a fight. But the board is breathing down my neck. If we don't find a permanent home for them soon, I might not have a choice." Maggie met Rachel's gaze, determination flashing in her eyes. "Then we'll find one." Later that day, Maggie sat at the front desk, laptop open, scrolling through the flood of messages and comments under Max and Daisy's video. Some offered words of encouragement. Others shared similar stories of rescue dogs finding homes. As she sifted through the posts, one comment caught her eye. "I wish I could take them, but I live too far away. Is there a way to sponsor their care?" Maggie's heart leapt. She quickly clicked on the profile. Stephanie McCall, a woman from Colorado who had adopted senior dogs before. Without hesitation, Maggie replied, "Thank you so much for your interest. Sponsoring their care might be an option. Let me speak with our shelter director and get back to you." Stephanie's response came within minutes. "I'm serious about helping. Keep me updated." Maggie's fingers flew across the keyboard. If Stephanie was willing to cover Max and Daisy's expenses, maybe the shelter board would reconsider Richard's offer. The next morning, Rachel was already in her office when Maggie burst in, practically glowing with excitement. "You won't believe this," Maggie began, dropping into the chair across from Rachel's desk. "I've been talking to a woman in Colorado. She's interested in sponsoring Max and Daisy until we find them a home." Rachel's eyebrows shot up. "Sponsoring their care? For how long?" "As long as it takes," Maggie said, unable to hide the hope in her voice. "She's adopted senior dogs before. She gets it." Rachel tapped a pen against the edge of her desk, considering. "It's a great idea, Maggie, but the board might still side with Richard. He's not going to back down easily. Maggie's face fell slightly, but she sat up straighter. Then we'll make sure the community knows what's happening. If enough people rally around Max and Daisy, the board won't have a choice but to listen. Rachel smiled faintly. You're relentless, you know that? Maggie grinned. I've been told. A new plan. By the afternoon, Maggie had launched a second video, updating the community on Richard's offer and the threat it posed to Max and Daisy's future. She was careful not to attack Richard directly, but made it clear that the two dogs needed a home, not a display case. We're fighting for Max and Daisy, but we need your help. If you've ever thought about adopting or fostering, now is the time. Let's find these two the family they deserve. The video spread faster than the first. Within hours, local news outlets picked up the story, featuring clips of Max and Daisy resting together, along with interviews from Maggie and Rachel. Phone calls flooded the shelter. People offered donations, temporary foster care, and even petitions urging the shelter board to reject Richard's proposal. Richard's reaction. 2 days later, Richard Coleman returned, stepping into the shelter like a storm cloud. Rachel intercepted him before he reached Maggie. Mr. Coleman, Rachel began calmly, blocking his path. I don't appreciate being made out as the villain in this, Richard said coolly, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. No one's calling you a villain, Rachel replied evenly. The community just wants what's best for Max and Daisy. Richard's lips tightened. So do I. But I don't intend to let public opinion sway my plans. I've made my offer clear, and I expect the board to honor it. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. You're not buying property, Mr. Coleman. You're talking about living beings. They deserve more than to be shut away. Richard took a step closer, lowering his voice. Let's not make this personal, Rachel. You have a shelter to run. I have the means to help you keep it open. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. There's more to running this place than just money. I won't sign off on something that goes against what we stand for. Richard's expression darkened, but he stepped back. Fine. But remember, not everyone on the board feels the way you do. A ray of hope. That evening, as Maggie was preparing to leave, her phone buzzed with a message from Stephanie McCall. I've spoken to my local rescue group. We're willing to coordinate a transport for Max and Daisy if the shelter allows it. I can foster them until we find them a permanent home. Maggie's heart soared. She forwarded the message to Rachel immediately. This could be it, Maggie said, pacing Rachel's office while the vet read the email. Stephanie's serious, and she has experience with dogs like Max and Daisy. Rachel smiled. Let's schedule a call with her tomorrow. If she's the real deal, we might finally have a solution. For the first time in weeks, Maggie felt like they were one step closer to giving Max and Daisy the home they deserved. But the storm wasn't over. In the shadows of Silver Creek, Richard Coleman wasn't finished fighting, and Maggie had no idea just how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. The morning air hung heavy with frost as Maggie unlocked the front door to Silver Paw's shelter. Her breath curled in the cold air, but inside, the place felt warmer than usual. There was a renewed sense of hope, like maybe, just maybe, things would work out for Max and Daisy. Rachel had already arrived, sitting at her desk with a steaming mug of coffee and the phone pressed to her ear. She glanced up at Maggie and gave her a small smile. Maggie waited until Rachel hung up. Stephanie? She asked eagerly. Rachel nodded. She's everything she claimed to be. Runs a small senior dog rescue in Colorado. She's fostering 3 older dogs right now and even has room for 2 more. She said transporting Max and Daisy is no problem. The rescue group she works with can arrange for the trip. Maggie's heart swelled. This is perfect. I can't wait to tell Max and Daisy they're finally going to a real home. Rachel chuckled. I think they might need a translator for that. The moment felt light, hopeful, until the shelter's front door swung open. Richard Coleman stepped inside. He moved with an air of authority, his heavy coat dusted with snow. 2 men in dark suits flanked him, one holding a clipboard. Rachel's expression hardened as she stood up. Maggie's stomach knotted immediately. Mr. Coleman, Rachel greeted stiffly. I wasn't expecting you today. Richard gave a tight-lipped smile. I didn't think I needed an appointment. This concerns the board's decision. Maggie stepped forward, placing herself protectively between Richard and Max and Daisy's kennel, which sat quietly in the corner. "The board hasn't made a final decision," she said firmly. Richard's eyes flicked to Maggie, his gaze unreadable but intense. "I think you'll find they have." He nodded to the man with the clipboard, who handed Rachel a sealed envelope. Rachel hesitated before peeling it open. Her eyes scanned the document, and her face paled slightly. "What does it say?" Maggie demanded. Rachel exhaled slowly. The board voted in favor of Mr. Coleman's offer. Max and Daisy are to be transferred to his estate by the end of the week. Maggie's blood ran cold. "No." Rachel's voice trembled with restrained frustration. "They didn't consult me on this." Richard's smirk returned. "I have a strong working relationship with several board members. They recognize that this shelter needs financial support." Maggie's fists clenched at her sides. "You can't do this. They're not just property to be auctioned off. They're bonded dogs. They need each other. And a home, not a trophy enclosure on your estate." Richard's gaze remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Harris, I understand your passion, but this isn't your decision to make. I've already agreed to donate $30,000 to the shelter. It will keep this place running for another year. Consider that a win for everyone." Maggie opened her mouth to argue, but Rachel placed a hand on her arm, silencing her. "Mr. Coleman," Rachel said, keeping her tone professional but cold, "give us until the end of the day. I'd like to speak with the board myself." Richard studied Rachel for a long moment before nodding. "Fine, but don't waste my time. I expect them ready by Friday." As Richard left, the room fell into a tense silence. Maggie's hands trembled with frustration. "They can't do this," she whispered. "It's not right." Rachel rubbed her forehead, her voice quiet but sharp. "I know, but I need to handle this carefully. The board listens to Richard because of his money. If we push too hard, we could lose more than just Max and Daisy." Maggie's heart pounded as she looked at the two sleeping dogs. They had no idea their fate was being decided by signatures and dollar signs. By late afternoon, Maggie paced the small break room, barely able to sit still. Rachel had spent the last 2 hours on the phone, trying to reason with the shelter board. When Rachel finally emerged, her face was grim. "They're not budging," Rachel said, her voice low. "Richard's offer is too good. The shelter needs the money, and they're convinced his estate is good enough for Max and Daisy." Maggie's mind raced. What if we move them before Friday? Get them to Stephanie's rescue in Colorado? Rachel frowned. "Technically, we'd be going against the board's order." "Technically," Maggie repeated, crossing her arms. "But it's the right thing to do." Rachel was silent for a long moment, staring through the office window at Max and Daisy curled together. "They deserve better," Rachel finally said. "Okay, let's do it." The plan. That night, Maggie made the arrangements. She contacted Stephanie, who agreed to meet halfway across state lines to pick up Max and Daisy. Everything was set. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the shelter before dawn. Rachel was already there, waiting with 2 large travel kennels. "We'll tell the board Max and Daisy went missing during the night," Rachel said quietly as she loaded Max into one of the kennels. Daisy followed willingly into the second. Maggie smiled softly, crouching in front of them. "You're going somewhere better. Somewhere safe." Max's tail thumped once against the kennel wall. The escape. Maggie and Rachel drove in silence along the snowy back roads, avoiding the main highways. They were halfway to the meeting point when Maggie's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach dropped. It was Richard Coleman. Rachel glanced sideways. "Don't answer." The phone buzzed again. Maggie bit her lip, heart hammering. Then another call came from the shelter. Maggie's hand trembled as she answered. "Hello, Maggie." It was Sarah, the shelter receptionist. Her voice was hushed but urgent. "Richard just showed up at the shelter. He knows Max and Daisy are gone. He's furious." Maggie's knuckles whitened as she gripped the phone. Rachel tightened her hands on the steering wheel. "Tell him they're safe." Sarah's voice lowered. "He's threatening legal action." Maggie's eyes darted to the kennels in the back seat. Max and Daisy lay quietly, unaware of the storm brewing around them. "We're almost there," Maggie whispered. Sarah paused. I'll stall him. Maggie hung up, staring at the road ahead. We're doing the right thing, Rachel said softly but firmly. Maggie nodded, her jaw set with determination. They weren't going to let Richard Coleman win. The narrow road stretched endlessly ahead, cutting through frost-laden trees as the sun crept over the horizon. Maggie's fingers tapped anxiously on her knee while Rachel drove, her eyes locked on the winding path before them. In the back seat, the faint sound of Max and Daisy's steady breathing filled the silence. Maggie stole a glance at the travel kennels behind her. Max lay curled tightly in his crate, his tail tucked neatly over his nose. Daisy's eyes flickered open occasionally, but she always found Max's steady presence beside her and drifted back to sleep. They looked so peaceful, Maggie whispered, more to herself than Rachel. Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I wish I could say the same for us. Maggie exhaled deeply. I still can't believe Richard's threatening legal action. What's he even going to claim? That we stole 2 dogs who were about to be euthanized? Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. He'll frame it differently. He'll say we defied the board's decision, which technically we did. That's enough to get us in trouble. Maggie's stomach churned. Defying orders for the right reasons didn't make the consequences any easier to swallow. 1 hour later, Rachel glanced at the GPS. We're about 30 minutes from the handoff point. Maggie nodded, pulling out her phone to check for messages. A text from Stephanie blinked on the screen. Stephanie McCall, on my way now. Etavederatsi, beroveita bostraren. Can't wait to meet them. Maggie smiled faintly, feeling the tension ease, until her phone buzzed again. Sarah Silver paused. Richard's furious. He's already called the board. I told him I didn't know where you were, but he's not backing down. Maggie's heart skipped. He's not letting this go, she murmured. Rachel sighed. I didn't expect him to. Men like Richard aren't used to hearing no. A sudden vibration startled them both. Maggie glanced down, an incoming call from Richard Coleman. She exchanged a look with Rachel, but neither of them made a move to answer. The call rang out, only to start again seconds later. He's relentless, Maggie grumbled, silencing the phone. He can keep calling. We're not stopping. 9:15 a.m., near the state border. The sky brightened as they approached the meeting point, a rest stop nestled just off the highway. Snowbanks lined the parking lot, and a few early travelers sipped coffee outside their cars. Rachel pulled into a quiet corner, turning off the engine. We're early, she said, leaning back with a sigh. Maggie unbuckled her seatbelt and twisted around to check on the dogs. Daisy blinked at her sleepily, and Max stretched, yawning wide. They're doing okay, Maggie said softly. Rachel nodded but didn't respond. Her gaze was distant, locked somewhere beyond the trees. What's wrong? Maggie asked. Rachel hesitated. I just keep thinking, what if this isn't enough? Maggie frowned. What do you mean? Rachel's voice dropped. Richard has resources we don't. Even if Stephanie takes them, Richard could push harder. He might find a way to track them down. Maggie's chest tightened. She hadn't considered that. You really think he'd go that far? Rachel met Maggie's eyes. Yes. A heavy silence filled the car. Then we make sure he can't find them, Maggie said firmly. Stephanie's experienced with rescues. She'll know how to keep them safe. Rachel nodded but didn't look convinced. 9:40 a.m. Handoff approaches. Maggie spotted Stephanie's silver Subaru pulling into the lot. A small decal of a paw print was stamped on the rear windshield. Maggie opened the door as Stephanie stepped out, bundled in a thick coat and waving cheerfully. You must be Maggie, Stephanie said, shaking her hand firmly. Maggie nodded, motioning toward Rachel. And this is Dr. Rachel Carter, the shelter's vet. Stephanie's gaze softened as she approached the kennels in the back seat. And these two must be Max and Daisy. Max's tail thumped against the crate at the sound of her voice, and Daisy lifted her head curiously. They're beautiful, Stephanie said quietly, crouching to their level. You're going to be okay now. Maggie felt a lump rise in her throat. This was it. The beginning of a new chapter for Max and Daisy. Rachel opened the trunk and carefully lifted the kennels onto the pavement. Max stepped out slowly, his joints stiff, but he pressed his nose to Stephanie's palm without hesitation. Daisy followed closely, circling around Max protectively. "They're attached," Maggie said with a small smile. Stephanie nodded. "I can see that. Don't worry. They'll stay together. I've got a quiet space ready for them at home." Maggie crouched to pet Max one last time, feeling his coarse fur beneath her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving them a chance." Stephanie's warm smile faltered slightly. "I just hope it's enough to keep them safe." Rachel and Maggie exchanged glances, knowing what she meant. As they prepared to leave, Rachel's phone buzzed again. Maggie's eyes flicked to the screen. Richard Coleman. Rachel's grip tightened on the phone, and she exhaled sharply. "I'll handle him," she said, stepping aside to take the call. Maggie turned back to Stephanie. "Let's get them loaded up." As Maggie helped secure the kennels in the back of Stephanie's car, Rachel's voice rose slightly behind them. "Mr. Coleman, they're gone." "You can't." Maggie's head snapped around. Rachel's eyes darkened as she listened to Richard's angry response. "No," Rachel said firmly. "I won't disclose their location." Maggie caught the sharp tone in Rachel's voice. "Goodbye, Richard." Rachel ended the call and exhaled deeply. "He's threatening to involve animal control." Maggie's heart sank. "Can he actually do that?" Rachel nodded grimly. "He can try." Stephanie closed the trunk and locked eyes with Rachel. "I'll keep them safe. Don't worry." Maggie forced a smile. "They're in the best hands now." Rachel nodded, but as they watched Stephanie's car disappear down the road, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't over. Richard Coleman wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. The hum of Stephanie's car faded into the distance, leaving behind the quiet rustle of wind through the snow-dusted trees. Rachel and Maggie stood by Rachel's car, watching the empty road long after Stephanie had disappeared. Maggie crossed her arms, rubbing them for warmth. "You think he's really going to involve animal control?" Rachel sighed, unlocking the car. "I wouldn't put it past him. Richard isn't the type to let things go quietly." Maggie climbed into the passenger seat, buckling her seatbelt. "What exactly can animal control do, though? Max and Daisy aren't his property. We're not breaking any laws." Rachel adjusted the rearview mirror, starting the car with a low rumble. "Technically, no. But Richard knows how to manipulate the system. He can spin this to look like we interfered with the board's decision, which gives him leverage. If the shelter board sides with him, it could get messy." Maggie frowned, watching the trees blur past as they drove. "Messy how?" Rachel's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Worst case, they could fire me and cut you from volunteering. Richard might pressure them to blacklist us from working with other shelters. Max and Daisy would end up back in his hands." Maggie's stomach tightened. The thought of Max and Daisy pacing inside a cold, isolated enclosure at Richard's estate felt like a betrayal of everything they had fought for. "We can't let that happen," Maggie said firmly. "There's got to be something we can do to stop him." Rachel's eyes narrowed in thought. "Maybe there is." Later that afternoon, back at the shelter, Rachel and Maggie returned to Silver Paw's shelter just as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Inside, the staff moved about quietly, cleaning kennels and feeding the animals. Sarah, the receptionist, glanced up from her desk, relief flashing across her face as Rachel approached. "Richard's been calling nonstop," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "I told him you were out, but I don't know how long that excuse will last." Rachel nodded. "Good. Keep deflecting. If he calls again, tell him I'll get back to him tomorrow." Maggie tugged off her coat and leaned against the counter. "What's the plan, Rachel? How do we stop him?" Rachel glanced around the shelter, ensuring no one else was in earshot. She lowered her voice. "Richard's strength is his reputation," Rachel began. "He uses it to influence the board, the town, even the shelter. But reputations can be fragile." Maggie's brow furrowed. "You want to go public?" Rachel nodded slowly. "We need to be careful, but yes. Richard's made it clear he's treating Max and Daisy like status symbols. If the community knows what he's trying to do, it might shift the board's opinion." Maggie's eyes lit up. "A public statement. We could write an open letter, explain the situation, and post it online. People already care about Max and Daisy. This could get them to rally behind us." Rachel smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." That evening, drafting the letter, Maggie sat at Rachel's desk, fingers flying across the keyboard. The glow of the computer screen lit up the small office, casting shadows along the walls. To the Silver Creek community, Maggie typed, her heart pounding as the words flowed. In recent weeks, many of you have shown incredible compassion and support for Max and Daisy, two inseparable dogs who have spent years at Silver Paws Shelter. Thanks to your kindness, we found a foster willing to give them the loving home they deserve. However, we now face an unexpected challenge. A local businessman, Richard Coleman, has expressed interest in adopting Max and Daisy for reasons that extend beyond genuine care for their well-being. His intention to house them in an enclosed estate contradicts what Max and Daisy truly need: a warm, loving family environment where they can thrive together. We believe animals are not trophies or property to be displayed, but living beings who deserve compassion and freedom. By standing with us, you're not just helping two dogs, you're protecting the values the shelter was built on. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she reread the draft. What do you think? She asked, glancing at Rachel. Rachel nodded approvingly. It's honest without being accusatory. That's exactly the tone we need. Maggie exhaled. I'll post it tonight. The next morning, the fallout begins. The post went live at dawn, and by noon, the shelter's inbox was flooded with messages. Maggie, I read the letter. What can I do to help? This is outrageous. We can't let him take them. We stand with Max and Daisy. Rachel smiled as she sifted through the responses. The tide was turning in their favor. But Richard wasn't one to sit quietly. By mid-afternoon, Rachel's phone rang. She recognized the number instantly. Here we go, she muttered, answering with a steady voice. Dr. Carter. Richard's tone was icy. I assume you're behind that letter. Rachel didn't blink. Maggie and I co-wrote it. You're playing a dangerous game, Rachel, Richard warned. Dragging my name into this. You think that'll stop me? Rachel leaned back in her chair, keeping her voice calm. It's not about stopping you. It's about doing what's right for Max and Daisy. If that means putting a spotlight on your intentions, so be it. Richard was silent for a long moment. Then his voice dropped lower. You're making this personal. I suggest you reconsider. Rachel's gaze hardened. I already have. The line went dead. Maggie looked up from across the room. What did he say? Rachel's eyes narrowed. He's not finished. Evening. A surprise at the shelter. As the staff prepared to close for the night, headlights flashed outside the shelter. Maggie peered through the window, her breath catching. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop. Richard stepped out, flanked by two men in suits. Rachel straightened. Looks like he came to make his point in person. Maggie's pulse quickened. What do we do? Rachel's jaw tightened. We stand our ground. The front door swung open with a sharp creak as Richard strode in, his polished shoes tapping against the tile floor. Dr. Carter, Richard said evenly, his gaze drifting to Maggie. Miss Harris. Maggie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. Richard crossed his arms. I'm here to resolve this civilly. You're making a mistake by challenging me. Rachel stepped forward, calm but firm. No, Richard. The mistake would be letting you take them. His eyes narrowed, but Rachel continued before he could speak. The community's behind us. If you try to force the board's hand, they'll answer to more than just you. Richard's gaze flickered, a flash of frustration crossing his face. This isn't over, he said quietly, turning toward the door. Rachel watched him leave, her heart pounding. Maggie exhaled slowly. I think we just bought Max and Daisy more time. Rachel smiled faintly. Let's hope it's enough. The chill of the night hung heavy as Richard's SUV disappeared into the darkness, leaving the shelter bathed in silence. Maggie watched through the window until the red taillights faded into the distance, tension still knotting her stomach. Rachel leaned against the reception desk, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The confrontation with Richard had left a mark, but there was no time to dwell on it. He's not bluffing, Rachel said quietly. I know his type. If he can't win the easy way, he'll escalate. Maggie turned, concern flickering in her eyes. What more can he do? Max and Daisy are already with Stephanie. They're out of his reach. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. Out of sight doesn't mean out of mind. Richard's influence stretches further than you think. If he wants to, He can involve animal control, the shelter board, even the authorities. He'll spin the narrative until we're the ones in the wrong. Maggie's heart sank. The weight of responsibility for Max and Daisy felt heavier than ever. The next morning, the community response. By the time the sun crested over Silver Creek, the shelter's phone lines were ringing off the hook. Emails poured in, donations ticked up, and messages of support flooded the shelter's social media pages. Maggie sat at the reception desk, juggling phone calls and scrolling through dozens of comments. "We're behind you, Rachel. Don't let that man get his way. Max and Daisy deserve better. Let us know how we can help. Richard Coleman's money can't buy compassion." Rachel stepped out of her office, holding a cup of coffee, but looking more tired than refreshed. "How bad is it?" Maggie gestured to the screen. "Not bad, good actually. People are furious. They're rallying around us." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "Let's hope it's enough to make the board listen." Maggie frowned. "What if they don't?" Rachel sighed. "Then we fight harder." A call from the board. By midday, Rachel's office phone buzzed. She glanced at the caller ID and grimaced. "It's them," she said under her breath. Maggie tensed in the doorway. Rachel picked up the receiver. "Dr. Carter speaking." Maggie watched as Rachel's expression shifted from neutral to tense. She couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but she could read Rachel's body language, the tightening of her jaw, the way her grip on the phone cord twisted. "Yes, I understand," Rachel said after a long pause. "But I stand by my decision. Max and Daisy are in good hands now." Another pause. Rachel's brows furrowed deeper. "With all due respect, I don't believe Richard Coleman's estate is the right environment for them. If the board sees otherwise, they'll have to overrule me directly." Rachel's eyes flicked up toward Maggie. "No, I'm not disclosing their location." Silence. Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "I appreciate the call, but my answer remains the same." She set the phone down softly, the room thick with unspoken tension. Maggie broke the silence. "Well," Rachel leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "The board isn't happy. They're meeting tomorrow to review the situation." Maggie's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" Rachel's expression darkened. "It means Richard's pushing hard. He's forcing their hand." Evening, forming a plan. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie and Rachel sat in the shelter's small break room, huddled over cups of lukewarm tea. The weight of the day pressed down on both of them. "We need to make sure we're ready for tomorrow," Rachel said finally. "If the board sides with Richard, we might lose more than just Max and Daisy." Maggie frowned. "What do you mean?" Rachel's voice softened. "If they see me as defiant, they could replace me. Silver Paws might fall under new management, and that could undo everything we've built here." Maggie's heart twisted. "That's not fair. You've given everything to this place." Rachel offered a faint smile. "Fair or not, it's reality." Maggie's eyes narrowed as an idea began to form. "Then let's remind the board why this shelter exists in the first place." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Maggie leaned forward, her voice steady. "We rally the community even harder. We invite people to the board meeting. Let them speak on behalf of Max and Daisy. If Richard wants to use influence, we'll counter with compassion." Rachel's smile grew. "That's risky, but I like it." The next day, the board meeting. Silver Creek's town hall was packed. Rows of chairs lined the room, filled with local residents, shelter volunteers, and supporters. Maggie recognized many faces. People who had donated, adopted pets, or simply followed Max and Daisy's story online. Rachel and Maggie stood at the front, facing the long oak table where 6 board members sat, their faces a mixture of neutrality and discomfort. Richard Coleman sat to the side, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk curling his lips. Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "Thank you all for gathering here today. I know time is valuable, but I believe what we discussed today reflects more than just a single adoption case. It reflects the values this shelter was built on." She paused, scanning the crowd. Max and Daisy are not just dogs. They are a symbol of resilience and companionship. For years, they've waited at Silver Paws, overlooked by potential adopters. But they found solace in each other. Maggie watched as Rachel's words resonated through the crowd. People nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling across the room. Rachel's gaze shifted to the board. Richard Coleman believes his estate is a suitable place for Max and Daisy. But I ask you, do they belong behind the walls of an estate or in the arms of a family who will love them as they deserve? A murmur of approval spread through the audience. Richard rose from his seat, his voice smooth but cold. Dr. Carter's passion is admirable, but passion doesn't keep the lights on. I've pledged $30,000 to this shelter, a sum that could save countless other animals. All I ask for in return are 2 dogs. A few board members exchanged glances, clearly torn. Maggie stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room. Max and Daisy aren't bargaining chips. They're living beings, and the people of Silver Creek know that. She gestured to the crowd. We've received hundreds of letters, emails, and calls from this community. People who believe Max and Daisy deserve better than to be trophies on someone's property. Rachel added softly, if this board truly stands for the welfare of animals, the decision should already be clear. Silence followed. Finally, the head of the board, an older woman with silver hair, cleared her throat. The board will deliberate and inform you of our decision by tomorrow morning. Maggie exchanged a hopeful glance with Rachel. The fight wasn't over yet, but hope lingered in the air. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across Silver Creek as the town stirred to life. Maggie sat at the shelter's front desk, her knee bouncing anxiously beneath the table. Her eyes darted to the clock on the wall, 8:15 a.m. The board's decision was expected by 9. Rachel sat across from her, silently sipping from a cup of black coffee. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the frost-laced window. Neither of them had slept much the night before. They can't side with Richard, Maggie muttered, breaking the silence. Not after yesterday. Rachel sighed, lowering her mug. Logic doesn't always win, Maggie. Sometimes money talks louder than compassion. Maggie frowned, her jaw tightening. I just can't wrap my head around it. Why is Richard so obsessed with Max and Daisy? He could adopt any dog from any shelter. Why them? Rachel met her gaze, her expression heavy. Because to him, they're a symbol, a prize. Richard doesn't like to lose. Maggie shook her head. Well, he's not getting them. Before Rachel could respond, the shelter phone rang, cutting through the quiet room like a sharp blade. Maggie lunged for it, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed it to her ear. Silver Paw's shelter, this is Maggie speaking. A familiar voice greeted her. It was Eleanor Walsh, the head of the shelter board. Good morning, Maggie. Is Rachel with you? Eleanor's voice was polite, but there was an edge of formality that made Maggie's stomach twist. She's right here, Maggie replied quickly, placing the call on speaker and setting the phone between them. Rachel leaned forward. Morning, Eleanor. I assume you have news for us? Eleanor's voice softened slightly, but the tension remained. Yes, Rachel. The board convened late into the evening, and after careful deliberation, we've made our decision. The room seemed to still. Maggie's pulse roared in her ears. The board has unanimously voted to deny Richard Coleman's request to adopt Max and Daisy. Maggie's eyes widened, and Rachel's shoulders sagged with relief. However, Eleanor continued, there were complications. Richard has already made a formal complaint and is threatening legal action. The board feels this situation could escalate, and they don't want the shelter's reputation at risk. Rachel straightened in her chair. So, what does that mean for Max and Daisy? Eleanor hesitated. It means we need them placed in a permanent home as soon as possible. Out of state if possible. We can't have them lingering at the shelter. Maggie nodded quickly. Stephanie McCall is fostering them in Colorado. She's already agreed to adopt them if necessary. Eleanor's relief was palpable. Good. The sooner, the better. I'll make a note in the records. As far as the shelter is concerned, Max and Daisy have been adopted. Rachel smiled faintly. Thank you, Eleanor, for standing by us. Eleanor's voice softened. Rachel, you've done more for this shelter than anyone else ever could. I know this wasn't easy, but you made the right call. The call ended, leaving the room in a stunned silence. Maggie leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. We did it. Rachel nodded, but her eyes remained clouded. We won this round, but Richard won't let this go. Not yet. Later that afternoon, a bitter goodbye. By mid-afternoon, Maggie sat on the floor of the shelter's break room, surrounded by half-packed boxes of supplies. It was supposed to feel like a victory, but a lingering unease kept her on edge. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was a message from Stephanie. Stephanie McCall, Max and Daisy are settling in well. Daisy's already found her favorite spot on the couch. Maggie smiled faintly, but the relief felt fleeting. Rachel stepped into the room, setting down a box beside Maggie. Stephanie just texted, Maggie said. They're doing okay. Rachel's lips curved slightly. That's good to hear. Maggie hesitated before speaking again. Do you really think Richard will keep pushing this, even after the board's decision? Rachel's expression hardened. Men like Richard don't let things go quietly. He'll keep looking for angles, and he'll wait for us to slip up. Maggie's stomach twisted. But Max and Daisy are gone. There's nothing left for him to fight for. Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully. Richard doesn't like losing control, Maggie. This was never just about the dogs. It's about power. And he just lost. Evening, a final visit. As the sun dipped low, Maggie found herself standing outside Max and Daisy's empty kennel. She knelt, running her hand along the now vacant space where their beds once lay. The quiet absence felt surreal. Sarah approached quietly, kneeling beside Maggie. You did something good, you know, Sarah said softly. Maggie's throat tightened. I know. It just feels strange, like it's not over yet. Sarah offered a gentle smile. That's because it isn't. But you bought them a chance at happiness, and that's more than most can say. Maggie nodded, brushing her hand across the kennel one last time. The next day, Richard's visit. It was nearly noon when Richard Coleman's black SUV pulled up to the shelter once more. Rachel watched from her office window as he stepped out, his movements precise and calculated. Maggie tensed beside her. He's back, Maggie muttered. Rachel took a deep breath. Let me handle this. She stepped out into the lobby just as Richard entered. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes swept the room sharply. I assume you've heard the board's decision, Rachel said evenly. Richard's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he responded. I have, and Rachel crossed her arms. Richard smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm not here to argue. Rachel's brow arched in skepticism. I wanted to congratulate you, Richard said smoothly. You fought hard for them. I underestimated your dedication. Rachel remained silent, sensing the weight behind his words. Richard's gaze flickered toward Maggie. Don't celebrate too soon. I'll be watching closely. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. With that, Richard turned and left without another word. The front door closed with a soft thud, leaving Rachel and Maggie in silence. Maggie exhaled deeply. That wasn't unsettling at all. Rachel nodded. We'll stay vigilant. But for now, Max and Daisy are safe. Maggie offered a small smile. That's all that matters. As they stood together in the quiet shelter, a fragile sense of peace settled over them. Fragile, but real. For the first time in weeks, it felt like hope had finally won. The snow had begun to melt in Silver Creek, leaving behind wet patches on the shelter's gravel parking lot. The air felt lighter, the tension that once wrapped around Silver Paw's shelter slowly dissipating with each passing day. Maggie stood by the reception desk, her eyes scanning the computer screen for updates. She clicked on Stephanie McCall's latest email and couldn't help but smile as she read. Max has claimed the biggest dog bed in the house. Daisy, of course, thinks the couch belongs to her. They're adjusting beautifully. Attached was a photo of Max sprawled across a plush dog bed, his face relaxed in deep sleep. Daisy perched delicately on the arm of a worn leather couch, her head tilted with curiosity as if she knew she had finally found home. Rachel approached from behind, peering over Maggie's shoulder. They look happy, she said, her voice soft but warm. They are, Maggie replied, unable to hide the pride in her voice. Stephanie said Daisy follows Max everywhere. I guess old habits die hard. Rachel chuckled. I wouldn't expect anything less. A week later, quiet days. Life at Silver Paw's shelter returned to its usual rhythm, though something felt different. Lighter. The fight for Max and Daisy had left an imprint not just on the staff, but on the community. Donations trickled in steadily, and more people expressed interest in adopting senior dogs. A change Maggie welcomed wholeheartedly. As Maggie refilled food bowls in the kennel area, Sarah strolled in, balancing a stack of paperwork in her arms. "Hey, did you see the article in the Silver Creek Gazette?" Sarah asked, setting the papers down. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "No, what article?" Sarah grinned, pulling out the folded newspaper and flipping it open to a full-page spread. A large headline stretched across the top. "Community fights for forgotten friends. The story of Max and Daisy." Maggie's heart skipped as she scanned the article. Beneath the headline was a picture of Max and Daisy snuggled together during their final days at the shelter. The article recounted the battle with Richard Coleman, the community's response, and ultimately the victory that ensured Max and Daisy's safety. "I didn't know they were writing this," Maggie said, surprised. Sarah shrugged. "I guess we got around. The community wanted to highlight what you and Rachel did. It's a good reminder of why we fight for these animals." Rachel entered the room, catching the tail end of their conversation. She leaned in, glancing at the article. "We didn't do it alone. The town rallied behind them. That's what made the difference." Maggie nodded, tracing the photo of Max with her finger. "Still, it feels nice to know they're safe." Rachel smiled but hesitated, her gaze shifting slightly. "What is it?" Maggie asked, catching the change in Rachel's expression. Rachel folded her arms, leaning against the wall. "I had another call from the board this morning. They want to discuss expanding the shelter, creating more space for senior dogs and harder-to-adopt animals." Maggie's eyes widened. "Wait, seriously?" Rachel nodded. "They're seeing the value in what we've done. And after the attention Max and Daisy's story brought in, they believe we can make a difference for more animals like them." A grin spread across Maggie's face. "That's incredible. When do we start?" Rachel chuckled. "Patience, Maggie. We need to go through planning and fundraising first, but it's a step in the right direction." Unexpected visitors. A few days later, as Maggie swept the front entryway, the soft chime of the front door caught her attention. She looked up to see a family entering, two parents with a little girl clutching a stuffed animal dog under her arm. Maggie set the broom aside and greeted them warmly. "Hi there. Can I help you find someone special today?" The little girl, no older than 7, peeked around her mother's leg and pointed at a nearby kennel where a gray-muzzled spaniel wagged his tail softly. The mother smiled. "We saw the article about Max and Daisy. It reminded us how much our home feels empty without a dog. We thought maybe we could give one of these older dogs a chance." Maggie's heart swelled. "That's wonderful. Let me introduce you to a few of our senior residents." She led the family toward the kennels, pausing by a gentle retriever mix named Bailey, who had been overlooked for months. The little girl knelt by his kennel, giggling as Bailey pressed his nose to the bars. Rachel appeared in the hallway, observing quietly. As the little girl reached through to scratch behind Bailey's ear, Rachel leaned toward Maggie. "Looks like we might have a new adoption soon." Maggie smiled. "One step at a time, right?" Rachel chuckled. "Exactly. A letter from Stephanie." That evening, as the shelter lights dimmed and the animals settled into their beds, Maggie sat alone in the break room, sifting through emails. One subject line caught her eye. A little update from Max and Daisy, well, mostly Daisy. Maggie clicked the email eagerly. "Hi, Maggie and Rachel. I thought I'd send a quick update on our two favorite house guests. Max is doing wonderfully. He's taken to sleeping by the fireplace every night, and I'm pretty sure he snores louder than I do. Daisy, on the other hand, has turned into a shadow. She follows Max everywhere, kitchen, living room, even the garden. She's happy as long as she's with him. We had a little scare with Max's arthritis acting up, but a few vet visits and some medication have him feeling like himself again. I can't tell you how grateful I am for the chance to care for them. They've filled our home with warmth. Thank you for trusting me with their care. I promise they'll know nothing but love for the rest of their days. All the best. Stephanie." Maggie wiped her eyes discreetly, though no one was around to see. Rachel entered the room, glancing at the screen. "Good news?" she asked softly. Maggie nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yeah, the best kind." Rachel sat beside her, watching as Maggie reread the email. "You know," Rachel said quietly, "Max and Daisy may not be here anymore, but they left something behind." Maggie tilted her head curiously. "What's that?" Rachel gestured toward the shelter's kennels, where Bailey now lay asleep in his bed, a half-filled adoption form pinned to the front of his kennel. "Hope," Rachel said simply. Maggie smiled, leaning back in her chair. For the first time in a long while, Hope felt like it belonged at Silver Paw's shelter. A soft drizzle misted the town of Silver Creek as Maggie stood at the front entrance of Silver Paw's shelter, gazing at the newly installed sign that read, "Silver Paws, Sanctuary for Seniors." The words felt warm against the cold morning air, a reflection of everything they had fought for over the past few months. Beneath the title, a smaller line in elegant cursive read, "In honor of Max and Daisy, forever friends." Maggie traced the letters gently with her fingertips, smiling to herself. It was a simple tribute, but one that carried the weight of countless memories. Max and Daisy weren't just dogs. They had become symbols of resilience, love, and the second chances every animal deserved. Rachel stepped outside, a clipboard tucked under her arm, and followed Maggie's gaze to the sign. "It feels right, doesn't it?" she said softly. Maggie nodded. "More than right. It feels like home." Rachel smiled faintly. "We're making progress. The shelter expansion project is officially underway. Once it's finished, we'll have room for twice as many senior dogs." Maggie's heart swelled at the thought. "I still can't believe the board approved everything." Rachel chuckled. They didn't have much choice. The community practically demanded it. After Max and Daisy's story, the board saw the value in focusing on seniors and harder-to-adopt animals. Maggie glanced at Rachel. "It wouldn't have happened without you." Rachel shook her head. "It wouldn't have happened without us." Later that day, new arrivals. The shelter bustled with quiet energy as Maggie helped unload a van of new arrivals. 3 senior dogs from a nearby, overcrowded rescue. They were gentle but nervous, their fur patchy from neglect. Maggie knelt beside a scruffy terrier mix, stroking his ear as he cautiously sniffed her hand. "You're safe now," she whispered. As Maggie led the terrier to his new kennel, Rachel followed behind with a large golden retriever whose eyes, though clouded with age, glimmered with curiosity. "They've been through a lot," Rachel said, glancing at the intake forms. "But I think they'll adjust quickly." Maggie smiled. "They always do, once they know they're loved." The retriever settled into his kennel, curling up peacefully. Maggie watched for a moment before stepping back. "Do you think we'll find them homes?" Maggie asked, her voice quiet. Rachel glanced around at the shelter, now filled with the soft rustling of blankets and the occasional thump of tails wagging. "I know we will," she replied, a familiar face. As Maggie finished her rounds in the afternoon, the shelter door chimed. She glanced up, expecting another volunteer or a delivery driver. But instead, a familiar figure stood in the entrance. It was Richard Coleman. Maggie's heart jumped, but she forced herself to stay calm. Richard's posture was less rigid than before, his hands tucked into the pockets of a modest coat rather than his usual tailored suit. Rachel emerged from her office, her expression instantly guarded. "Mr. Coleman," Rachel greeted carefully. "What brings you by?" Richard's gaze flicked toward the kennels, his eyes lingering on the new arrivals. "I heard about the expansion project," he said evenly. "Thought I'd come see it for myself." Rachel exchanged a glance with Maggie, unsure of his intentions. "Feel free to look around," Rachel offered, her tone neutral. "But we're still in the early stages." Richard nodded slowly, stepping further into the shelter. As he moved down the aisle, he paused by the retriever Maggie had helped earlier. The dog lifted his head, meeting Richard's gaze with gentle curiosity. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, to Maggie's surprise, he crouched beside the kennel, extending his hand through the bars. The retriever sniffed it cautiously before nudging it softly with his nose. Rachel and Maggie watched in silence as Richard's expression softened. Finally, Richard stood, brushing off his hands. I underestimated what you're doing here, he admitted quietly. I thought I was saving those dogs by taking them. I realize now I wasn't thinking about what they actually needed. Rachel's guard eased slightly. They needed more than a place to stay. They needed someone who saw them as family. Richard nodded, his gaze distant. I suppose I've always been better at collecting things than caring for them. Maggie stepped forward, her voice gentle. It's never too late to change that. Richard's eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time, there was no trace of arrogance. Only quiet reflection. I'd like to make a contribution, Richard said suddenly, his voice firm but sincere. Not to take any animals, just to help with the expansion. Rachel hesitated, studying him carefully. After a moment, she nodded. We'd appreciate that. Richard extended his hand, and Rachel shook it briefly. As Richard turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at the retriever one last time. Maggie couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere deep down, he had seen a reflection of himself in the dog's quiet, steady eyes. Evening reflections. The sky turned shades of orange and purple as Maggie locked up the shelter for the night. Rachel lingered by the window, watching the last of the day's light fade over the horizon. You think he'll really change? Maggie asked, leaning beside her. Rachel exhaled slowly. I think people can surprise you. Sometimes it takes losing a battle to realize what truly matters. Maggie smiled faintly. Even Richard Coleman has a heart. Who knew? Rachel chuckled. Stranger things have happened. As they stood together, a peaceful stillness settled over the shelter. The animals slept soundly in their kennels, safe and warm, and the faint echo of Max and Daisy's presence lingered like a quiet reassurance that the fight had been worth it. A future full of hope. In the weeks that followed, the expansion plans moved forward, driven by community support and generous donations. The shelter's walls stretched wider, new kennels were built, and soon the sanctuary would be ready to welcome more senior animals in need. One afternoon, Maggie received an email from Stephanie. Max and Daisy spent the morning chasing butterflies in the garden. I don't think I've ever seen them happier. Thank you for giving them the chance to live out their days like this. Maggie smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. As Rachel passed by, Maggie called out, Hey Rachel, I think we did something really good here. Rachel paused, glancing at Maggie with a soft smile. Yes, she said. I think we did too. And as the doors to Silver Paws opened once again to greet a family looking for their forever friend, Maggie knew that this was only the beginning of something even greater. Because sometimes the smallest victories have the power to change everything.